A nobleman's wife has just given birth. She's weak, her milk hasn't come in properly, or perhaps she simply refuses to nurse. Within hours, a messenger is sent to the village. Find a wet nurse, bring her to the manor. By sunset, a peasant woman arrives, her own infant less than 3 months old. She's offered a contract: live in the manor, feed the noble child, receive payment and shelter. One condition: her own baby stays behind. The choice is immediate: wealth and security for one child, or poverty and uncertainty for both. What would you do when survival demands you choose which baby lives? Before we explore the impossible economics that turned motherhood into a market, if you're fascinated by how medieval women navigated brutal choices between love and survival, subscribe now. The most devastating part is still ahead. In medieval Europe, breastfeeding wasn't optional. Without formula, without safe alternatives, an infant who couldn't nurse would die within days. For wealthy families, hiring a wet nurse solved multiple problems. Mothers could recover from childbirth faster, maintain their social duties, and avoid the physical demands of nursing. For noble women especially, frequent pregnancies were expected. Nursing delayed the return of fertility, and heirs were needed quickly. A wet nurse freed the mother's body for its primary aristocratic function, producing more children. But the trade created an immediate crisis for the women hired. Lactation doesn't work on demand. You can't simply start producing milk because someone offers you money. A wet nurse had to be actively nursing her own child. Her breasts had to be full, her milk supply established. This meant only one category of women qualified: those who had recently given birth themselves. Guild records and household contracts from 14th and 15th century France and England reveal the hiring process. Noble families sent agents to villages immediately after births were reported. Midwives were paid to provide names. The ideal candidate was young, healthy, recently delivered, and desperately poor. Poverty wasn't incidental, it was essential. A woman with options wouldn't take the job. The contract was straightforward: move into the manor, nurse the employer's child exclusively, maintain your milk supply, and remain available at all hours. Payment varied: some received wages, others room and board, a few got clothing or future support for their own children. What the contract rarely mentioned explicitly, but everyone understood, was this: your own baby would not come with you. Why? Because a wet nurse couldn't feed 2 infants adequately. Milk production, while adaptable, has limits. Noble families paid for exclusive access to that milk. Sharing it with the nurse's own child was seen as theft. Some contracts spelled this out directly: the wet nurse's infant must be weaned or given to another caretaker. Others simply made it logistically impossible. The nurse lived in the manor, often in the noble child's nursery, available day and night. There was no room for her own baby. So the choice arrived with brutal clarity: accept the job and leave your infant behind, or refuse and remain in poverty with your child. For many women, the calculation was grim. If she stayed home, both she and her child might starve. If she took the job, her child might survive on alternative feeding, however risky, and she would earn enough to eventually support her family. The contract offered survival, but it demanded separation. What happened to the wet nurse's own baby? The answer depended on family structure and resources. If the woman had a mother, sister, or mother-in-law still capable of lactating, the baby might be passed to that relative. Shared nursing within extended families was common in peasant communities. Milk was a resource distributed according to need, but if no nursing relative existed, the alternatives were grim. Some infants were given to other village women who had recently weaned their own children. These women would attempt to restart their milk supply through constant suckling, a process that sometimes worked but often didn't. The baby would lose weight, cry constantly, and struggle to thrive. Others were fed pap, a mixture of bread soaked in water or milk from animals. Cow's milk, goat's milk, sheep's milk, all were used despite medieval medical texts warning against them. Physicians knew these substitutes caused digestive problems, but they were the only option. Infant mortality rates for babies fed on pap or animal milk were catastrophic. Parish records from rural England show that children separated from nursing mothers had death rates exceeding 50% within the first year. Some died from malnutrition, others from contaminated water used to mix the pap. Still others from diseases their immune systems couldn't fight without breast milk's antibodies. For the wet nurse living in the manor, this knowledge was constant. Every time she fed the noble child, she knew her own baby was struggling. Letters and household accounts occasionally reference wet nurses requesting leave to visit their infants, and these requests were usually denied. The contract was explicit: the noble child's needs came first. If the wet nurse left, even briefly, her milk supply might decrease. That was unacceptable. Some women found ways to send money home, hoping it would buy better food or care for their children. Others sent messages through servants or visiting relatives, but many had no contact at all for months. They simply lived in the nursery, nursing another woman's child, wondering if their own baby was still alive. The psychological toll was acknowledged in confessional manuals. Priests were instructed to question wet nurses about their feelings of resentment or hatred toward the children they fed. The church recognized that forced intimacy with another woman's child, while separated from your own, created moral and emotional conflicts, but the economic system remained unchanged. Wet nursing contracts came with strict rules. The nurse's diet was controlled. She was forbidden from eating certain foods believed to sour milk, onions, garlic, heavily spiced dishes. Her behavior was monitored. Sexual activity was prohibited because pregnancy would stop lactation. Alcohol was limited. Even her emotional state was regulated. Anger, sadness, or stress were thought to poison the milk, so wet nurses were expected to maintain calm, cheerful demeanors regardless of their personal circumstances. These rules were enforced by the household steward or the noble mother herself. Violations led to immediate dismissal, and dismissal meant loss of payment and shelter. For a woman who had already sacrificed her own child for this job, being sent away was catastrophic. She would return home penniless, possibly to find her infant dead or sickly, with no way to restart lactation if months had passed. Guild regulations in some towns formalized these expectations. In 15th century Florence, wet nurse contracts were registered with city authorities. The documents specified duration, payment, and behavioral requirements. One surviving contract from 1432 lists 14 separate prohibitions, including restrictions on travel, visitors, and even sleeping position. The wet nurse was to sleep on her back to avoid compressing her breasts and reducing milk flow. Medical texts from the period treated wet nurses as milk-producing machines. Physicians debated the ideal wet nurse's characteristics. She should be between 20 and 30, neither too fat nor too thin, with a ruddy complexion indicating good health. Her breasts should be neither too large nor too small. Her temperament should be calm. Her moral character should be irreproachable, because her qualities would transfer through the milk to the nursing child. This medical discourse ignored the wet nurse's own suffering. It focused entirely on optimizing milk quality for the paying customer. The woman's feelings about leaving her child, her grief, her fear, these were irrelevant variables. What mattered was milk production. Everything else was secondary. The economic calculation was coldly rational from the employer's perspective. Hiring a wet nurse was expensive but worthwhile. It ensured the noble infant's survival while freeing the mother for other duties. For the wet nurse, the calculation was desperate. The job offered more money than she could earn any other way, but it cost her the chance to raise her own child. The mortality gap between fed and unfed infants was visible to everyone. Noble children raised on wet nurses had survival rates far higher than peasant children fed on substitutes. This wasn't subtle. Families could see the difference in their own villages. The wealthy thrived while the poor buried their babies. Some wet nurses attempted negotiation. Household records mention women asking to bring their own children to the manor or requesting shorter contracts. These requests were almost always denied. The system depended on exclusivity. Sharing milk meant diluting the service, and employers wouldn't pay full price for partial access. A few women found employers willing to nurse 2 infants simultaneously. These arrangements were rare and usually involved exceptional circumstances, such as the noble child having a twin, or the employer being sympathetic due to personal loss. But even then, the wet nurse's own child was considered secondary. If milk supply seemed insufficient for both, the noble child's needs took priority. The trade also created a parallel market in milk theft. Women who lost wet nurse positions sometimes attempted to nurse wealthy children informally, without contracts, hoping for payment. Others were accused of diluting their milk by nursing their own babies secretly. These accusations led to guild investigations and public punishment. In one case from 1380s London, a wet nurse was fined and banned from the trade for allegedly feeding her own child while under contract to a merchant family. The enforcement of these rules reveals the power imbalance clearly. Employers had legal recourse, guild support, and social standing. Wet nurses had only their bodies and their need. If accused of contract violations, they had no meaningful defense. Their word against their employers was no contest. Disease added another layer of danger. Wet nurses living in close contact with noble households were exposed to illnesses their own village communities rarely encountered. When plague, smallpox, or measles swept through a manor, the wet nurse was often among the first infected. Her job required constant physical contact with the nursing child, and if that child fell ill, she couldn't refuse to continue nursing without breaking her contract. Conversely, wet nurses sometimes brought diseases from their home villages into noble households. This created paranoia. Employers began requiring health inspections before hiring. Physicians examined potential wet nurses for signs of illness. checking their skin, teeth, and breath. Women with any visible ailment were rejected, regardless of their milk quality. This health screening was one-directional. No one checked whether the noble household was safe for the wet nurse. If she contracted an illness in service, she received no compensation and was often dismissed immediately to prevent further contagion. The risk was entirely hers. The emotional consequences of wet nursing are harder to document, but appear in indirect sources. Church court records mention wet nurses seeking absolution for feelings of hatred toward the children they nursed. Confession manuals instruct priests to ask these women whether they had wished harm upon their charges. The fact that these questions were standardized suggests the feelings were common. Some women bonded with the children they nursed, creating complex emotional dynamics. After months of feeding and caring for a noble infant, a wet nurse might feel genuine affection. But this affection coexisted with resentment. The child represented everything her own baby lacked: adequate food, medical care, attention, safety. Loving another woman's child while mourning the loss of your own created an impossible psychological space. A few narrative sources describe wet nurses returning home to find their own children dead or permanently weakened. One letter from a 15th-century Italian merchant mentions his wife's wet nurse requesting leave after receiving news of her infant's death. The request was granted, but only after the merchant's child was weaned. The wet nurse's grief had to wait until it was convenient for her employer. These stories were not anomalies. They were the system functioning as designed. Wet nursing worked because women had no better options. The trade depended on poverty, desperation, and the willingness of wealthy families to exploit both. By the late medieval period, some cities attempted regulation. Guild rules specified minimum wages and maximum contract lengths. A few required employers to provide medical care if the wet nurse fell ill. But enforcement was weak, and violations rarely led to meaningful punishment. The economic incentives were too strong. Wealthy families needed wet nurses, and poor women needed income. The exploitation continued because both parties were trapped by their circumstances. The legacy of medieval wet nursing persists in ways we rarely acknowledge. The practice normalized the idea that women's bodies could be commodified, that maternal labor had a price, and that some children's lives were worth more than others. These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were daily realities for thousands of women who traded their milk, their time, and their own children's welfare for survival. How did medieval wet nurses survive selling their milk? Many didn't. They sacrificed their own children's health and lives for a chance at economic stability that rarely materialized. They endured separation, grief, and guilt, bound by contracts that treated their bodies as resources and their feelings as irrelevant. They lived in the homes of the wealthy, while their own babies died in villages they couldn't visit. They fed children who would inherit titles and land, while their own children inherited nothing but hunger and absence. Survival for a wet nurse wasn't about thriving. It was about making an impossible choice and living with the consequences every single day, one feeding at a time, one sacrifice after another, until the contract ended or her milk ran dry. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.